Thanks. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to the Quadrant Community Call, May the 28th, 2024. And short calendar or agenda, I think it's a very leaky abstraction that's there being abstracted away. Alex, what do you want to talk
Yeah.
about?
So it's so way back when. Can we get the actual date? Probably it has a date, right? So September last year, we started on RC6, which is the configuration of quadrant subcomponents. And hopefully I'm not gonna screw that one up too much, but because I'm just catching through it like right now. But based on my understanding, here is how things work today. We have a set of fields from lower level CRs, I'm going to call them, and I'm going to pick unlimited or right now, that get exposed all the way up, imported through the Go code module thing, blah, 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 and so forth, right? So that's the way that you get to configure the underlying subcomponents. And I want to sort of propose a different way of going about this. And the idea is to, instead of having granular fields bubble up, it's actually compose them into higher level intents. So there is one thing that came up recently with regards to observability in limited or, to keep on picking on limited or. Today depends if Adam merged this PR or not. But what you had to do, let's say until now, is have two fields, let's say coordinated. You would have to set where the traces for tracing need to be sent, so the address of the collector, and you would have to set a log level to a proper level so that this translates into, somebody made a stupid decision, I can tell because I'm the somebody, to wire things with the log level. I don't remember why I did that. It was a dumb idea. But long story short, you end up with those two things that are trying to say the same thing in the end, right? And based on the model that we have now, you would need to bubble that stuff up, the two of them, to let people, and then tell people, set that to blue and this one to 42, and now things behave as you expected. So obviously, I guess I don't think I need to make a case that that's not the best way of doing it. So I'm more thinking that let's keep on using observability as a thing, right? That ideally, you would set a collector address or configuration at the quadrant layer. That in turn would configure whatever that would mean to the underlying things properly, right? So if that means setting 27 fields, so be it. If that means setting one field, so be it. Let's use the case of the trace level stuff. Maybe you end up in a situation where you want to have, let's say the trace level is part of the configuration of the quadrant level. I'm not arguing for this. I just need a concrete example, right? I think ideally what you would be able to do is override that level at the limit store CR level, because you care about having info level tracing there because you're trying to debug a problem right now, right? No need to set a more granular level inside Authorino, Envoy, and whatever other things you have on the data plane, because there everything's working fine. It's, again, some code that Alex wrote that's misbehaving, and that's what you're hunting down, right? So I think having a behavior where now if I change this inside the limited OCR, the quadrant operator overriding this for me, I don't think is a desirable behavior. So all that to say, I think if we start flipping the model around and we start thinking about what level, like I look at this tree more as an abstract levels of abstractions, right? So let's somebody say want to do rate limiting by default. Oh, no limitador there. All right, I spin up a limitador with in-memory counters because how would I guess a Redis address instead, right? That's not an option. So I do that. Now, if I want to use Redis to store my counters in, I can go to that limitador CR, override that behavior, and so forth. If that in turn would render something non-compatible, I think instead of overriding it, that should be reflected at a higher level of abstraction again, right? So let's reuse observability. Maybe if I turn observability on at the quadrant layer, but I turn it off at all the sub component layers, maybe the status stanza would tell me something about, hey, well, you're asking for this. It's only not going to happen because someone like overrode that decision explicitly underneath to turn that stuff off. Yeah, so it's a change, I think, in the way that we configure all this, but I think it's a desirable one, and I'm gonna finish with my rationale here, Thomas, and then I'll let you. Because many things in our APIs are alpha, like are changing a lot, whatever the level is of maturity that we pretend they are, right? We're changing many things quite a bit, but I don't think that we're changing necessarily the end game of it, right? It's just a mean on how you achieve that. And right now, all of this leaks all the way up, all the details leak or partially leak. And that can also become a problem, right? Oh, yeah, you can configure the collector address, but you can't configure the log level. And as such, well, you won't get any logs, right? So feature broken. So I guess one of the goals of doing it that way is I think that we let users control to the most granular level possible all of their components without pushing that initial complexity on them necessarily right away, right? But rather express things in more abstract, higher level terms at a quadrant layer, and then by default we'll do the right thing, the most sensible thing or whatever, and then people can go and override their behavior. So I wanted to socialize this idea, I guess, and see what people think. So all the people, Thomas, you're done. You don't.
I wanted to, sorry for just taking my hand up back again without having it raised. Yeah, well, so I think I understand, and you've told this, you said this before, and it's like basically you don't. So the only thing so if you want to control more, you have to dig deeper, and you have to. It's more complex, and that's okay because you want the simpler user experience for the person who knows less, who wants less difficult things. So you want them to at the quadrant layer, you don't want all that. Okay, I'm probably using all the wrong words here. You don't want to have all that complexity thrown at that person's face. Although I can imagine that you could still do both of those things and still have it all in the quadrant layer. You can also imagine where there is like a sort of an API that lets you set certain things at a less granular level at the quadrant level, and that flips then in turn a lot of things. Could be like 5 different things in the 5 different places, but you could have that same more granular API also at the quadrant level without not necessarily having to send that person to all the individual components. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but you could combine those 2 things, I think. You know what I mean? You don't have to send somebody to the other components.
I'm just gonna say yes for now, and let other people talk. I think you're complecting things more doing it that way.
Maybe.
Okay.
But, okay, that's it.
I don't know who's oh, open queue. Look at that. Jacob is next, apparently.
Yeah, I briefly touched this or talked with Jim a while ago, I think last week. My problem with this is, do we really need to configure limitator on both quadrant level and limitator level? You are talking about granular configuring limitator on a limitator CR level, but I think it will be much simpler for this and few other examples or our issues to just leave it the full configuration on quadrant level.
Okay, so I'm going to be very anal again. Sorry about this. I think the word you're looking for is easy. I don't think it's simple. But it's just not being anal. Am I understanding this right? You feel it's easier for you to having as a user, which I guess is the point you're defending right now, to only have to deal with a single CR to do everything you have to do. Is this correct, or am I misunderstanding your point?
Yes, but I think the right word is consistency. Because right now, the quadrant CR reflects configuration of quadrant CR reflects the behavior of limitator. Because if you have two configurations for quadrant and limitator, you need to merge them for expecting state of a limitator as a whole. I don't know if that makes much sense, but I'm trying.
I think you meant quadrant at the end. So, yeah. but that's so today that's the case, right? So I'm not arguing that. I'm not using this as an argument against or for what you just said, right? Today it's a reality that we have, right? You have a quadrant CR and you have a keep on picking on limitador, right? But we can interchange limitador with Arduino or any other subcomponents that may or may not exist at some point, right? So the design that we have right now is that, right? So there is a limitador CR and there's a quadrant CR, and it happens so that the definition of the limitador CR is actually, that one's fun. It's partially integrated inside the quadrant one.
Yes.
Right? So the duplication exists, whether we want it or not. The thing, and they speak the same language, right?
Yeah, but currently, if you configure something in quadrant, it can change just partially in limitator, and it's a hard topic for me. I was really talking with Jim, and I had troubles to really figure this out. What can and what can't be changed, and what will be the outcome for.
Well, and that was my point with the. I don't remember what I used as an example. I think, like in the case of like conflicting information, right? This would need to be reflected properly. So yeah. And anyways, Agus?
Thanks. I don't have a clear opinion or answer yet to your open question for layers of abstraction. Instead, I have a question to verify my one assumption I'm doing, and then I have a comment. The question is, the example you mentioned was, I want to clarify. You may define some collector for the metrics for observability, but if the log level is not at certain level, traces will not be generated. So there could be some misconfiguration. That's the example you.
Yeah, it may not be the best example that I chose there, but I can do more, right? I can go inside the distributed global rate limiting and blah blah. Like I just used one recent example that was discussed.
Okay, no, I'm going to be short. Then my comment would be to that is that maybe it's a mistake to couple, because it's coupling, tracing feature
Mhm.
with log level. Maybe.
Yeah,
But anyway.
okay, if you want to pick on the example, but then let me use another example, right? So today, if you want to do global rate limiting, and I insist on the term, right?
Mhm.
This is today coupled with you using Redis or a Redis speaking protocol thing. So from limitador perspective, it means you need to tell it something that starts with Redis, possible 1 or 2s, depending, colon / right?
Mhm.
If you don't configure the Redis store, you're not going to get that. So
Mhm.
that's coupling yet again, right? At the quadrant layer, what exists, well, today, that's maybe not really clear, but if you want to do some kind of a global / distributed rate limiting, that's, I think, what you would express, right? Now you would also need to express inside the limitador portion of the quadrant CR that it needs to use Redis. If you don't do those two things, then you're not going to get the result you wanted, right? So that would be one concrete thing where I would go, you know what? Move the logic of knowing what it implies to do global / distributed rate limiting inside the quadrant operator. That can now be conditional on what version of limitador are you using, right? And not tied to the very specific one shipped along with it, and asserts that the configuration underneath is proper, either by doing it itself because it can, or reporting back to you that it can't do it. I can go on a little bit, and then I'll give you the mic. Talking about, I'll let you. It's an open question again. Like if we keep on picking on observability, right? Now, if you want to observe stuff, would you move it that every individual subcomponent inside the quadrant CR would need to be configured to use that collector? Or would you see an overarching one? Or would you see both? Right? That's the same thing again, right? We sort of leak all the complexity all over. Though what we could do is you just do once and for all the components, that whatever the components mean. That's another one that we had talked about, by the way, I realized. Where we would only deploy Authorino if you had an auth policy. If you don't, you don't need to, right? So same thing again now. I don't even have an Authorino. Why would I need to configure anything about it quite yet? At the quadrant layer, what I care about is having observability about what's going on, maybe at the data plane layer, right? Or maybe broader than that. And so I configure that intent, right? And then I don't intend to run Authorino. I don't intend to run limitador. I want to have rate limiting. And so when those things now get, the sum of the two, I go and I configure that thing. See, it becomes more at the quadrant layer. I guess I would see it more as an intent-driven API, declare what I expect to happen. And then at the lower level is how that stuff actually happens. Sorry, Guy.
No problem. I think it's important that we qualify the problem better here, right? The leakage of the details from the underlying layers that we depend on to the upper level in itself is not an issue, is not a problem. The problem is something else that you mentioned, Alex, which is the coupling between those two layers. In fact, when we decide to expose at the upper level something that we use at the lower level from some dependency, in itself, I would say that is a good practice rather than a problem, right? At the very least, you are creating another layer of abstraction that gives you the buffer that you need to change things in the future if you need to, right? Even if you copy one-to-one the things that you have from the lower layer to the upper one, as long as that is not, based on coupling or not leading to coupling, you're fine. So in itself, what we call leakage or leaky abstractions, I wouldn't say is necessarily a bad thing, right? Then
Sorry, just me.
Mhm.
When I say leak abstraction, I don't think that's what we have. What I'm arguing for is leak abstractions, meaning abstractions that it let you go grab underneath of them and pull that thing out. It's just a wording thing, right? So I don't care. Just to be clear, yeah, I wasn't. So we both agreed that leak is good, I guess, even though we didn't mean the same thing with it. Sorry, just
right, and another point that I would like to address is something that Jakub raised about the consistency, right? And consistency compared to how we've been doing things here and there, either in the Kuadrant CI, respectively to the underlying subcomponents or the configuration of the subcomponents, like operating in the door, but also at the policy APIs, right? We also have the same pattern there. In the policy APIs, we've been very consistent in the sense that those are the only APIs we expose. So if you want to get something configured in any of the underlying subcomponents we use, the only way to get that done is by creating or modifying policy resources, right? To bring a more concrete example, nobody is allowed to modify an author alt config if you're a user of Quadrant. Rather, you do that by modifying the Quadrant alt policy. Even though, to a good extent, the specification of the alt policy and the alt config are identical, right? We're literally bringing the definitions from one type into the other, right? But we decided to expose an API only the alt policy. And similarly, I think we can apply here for the other kinds of policies, right? If you've never modified an Istio WASM plugin or a limitador CI, rather what you do is you only touch the rate of deposits and so on. So I think it's also consistent or inconsistent in this case in comparison to how we're doing things for the policy side as well, not only for configuring the components.
Should I just
Thomas?
talk? Yeah. Am I correct to understand, because I'm coming at it from a UX perspective, basically, like that you want to allow a user to think about a feature at the level of the feature and not at the level of how that is implemented. Like the examples you gave is like I want to get something done. If I'm at the Quadrant level, I think at this level, and then I want to set one switch, and that should do it then for me. I should not have to think on 3 different things that I have to change. That's the objective, right? Or am I completely misunderstanding it?
no, yeah, that's part of it. Yes, because yeah, the reason I said part of it is also because of where we are, right? I think because we're moving the house quite a bit, right? And so that means now by exposing the how to the finest detail to the end user, you're pushing all of that complexity on them to deal with them. I won't say not initially, because, and hopefully I'm not misquoting this, but so some fields have default values. We try to have those as proper defaults, and but they still leak one. Well, they still leak. They're being exposed one-to-one, right? So that's the pattern why when it's not like that for the rate limit policy, for instance, right? That's not the way rate limit policy works. We made the rate limit policy more approachable, let's say, than the granular detail that you get inside what a limit actually looks like to limitador. So yeah, now whether the pattern of nobody should touch that or whatever should be kept that way, honestly, I don't know that, because I'm also, I guess, slightly challenging that, right? Which is, hey, if you have a very good reason and you're crazy enough or brave enough, whatever the word would be, to go and tweak, let's say, the config map for limits door, right? And you better don't screw that one up, because trust me, that's going to make your life a pain, especially if that's production cluster. Should we really stand in the way of having a user doing that? It's like, maybe I'll power it to you, and hopefully you know what you're doing. But now the contract also becomes more, I guess, explicit, that you sort of crossing a line, right? And like, oh, I said this thing to this, to blue, and this one to 42, and now all of a sudden rate limiting isn't working anymore. Because yeah, duh, obviously, blue and 42 don't work together.
I think that goes down to like what we document as what are the interfaces to the product. Like, people can use other interfaces that we don't document, but then
Yeah.
the shit breaks in there. It's like, hey, we didn't tell you to do it that way. You know what I'm saying? Or
And that's actually part of, okay, I know it's a community call, but hey, whatever. That's part of this, and the product part is a big driver. When I say it's partial, the driver, I would much rather expose for a product the intent rather than the how we do this, based on the timeline of the release of the product. That's the other rationale behind my thinking. But I think honestly, everybody benefits from that, right? Because unless you really care about knowing what the implementation of that thing is, because you need to drive it to that, why would you be exposed to that, right? The rationale remains the same.
I'm sorry, I'm feeling a bit lost here. Do we have an actual proposal of what do you want to achieve with this conversation? Is there an actual decision to be made here?
No, I don't even expect it like necessarily consensus or anything. As I said, I wanted to socialize the idea. I'm sadly enough not where I want to, but part of my RFC for distributed, not global, rate limiting is gonna touch some of that. Yeah. Anyways, I think I'm gonna imply it in the thing, and I guess it'll become more applicable, when that comes to life. But yeah, I'm sorry. That's the other one I wanted to have there, but I saw nothing on the agenda, so I thought, hey, maybe that's worthwhile because of the event with observability, which I think is another sort of side effect of that. Well, is another instance of this problem, right? Plus, right now it's so that one's a good one because no, the log level we had, I think, exposed, right? So right now you could end up with that, right? Oh yeah, that we didn't expose that knob to the higher level API, and as such, you can't set it at all right now. But you could argue that's on us, right? But see, like, but what annoys me the most right now is I think that the conflation of the how and the intent, right? At the quadrant layer, I would much rather see an intent-driven API than a how API, right? So I want observability. And yeah, we know you need a collector for that because, right? So just do that. And then whatever it means for the underlying thing, it just does it, right? And then if all of a sudden you add limitador, like rate limiting as a use case to your deployment, you had declared that you wanted to have tracing, well, it gets it automatically, and I'll need to go and reconfigure this again. And we can get, so thinking about rate limiting for sure, right? We can go to a thing that you don't even have to concern yourself with limitador at all, right? You just put a rate limit policy there, and say, oh yeah, I need a limitador, bootstraps it, blah, blah, blah. And then you want restartability or whatever, then you start looking how you achieve that. But instead of exposing that, maybe you say that again, what you care about. So that's another good one. Restartability for limitador. right? If you're in a multi-cluster environment, do I need to persist the thing to disk? Or if all the cancels are persisted in a cluster next door, is that enough, right? So what is it that you want? Disk persistence or restartability? Do you want to have, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, anyways, whatever.
Is
This
it also
other-
true that the intelligence for the translation of that one API call at the quadrant layer, translating that to the multiple things that need to happen underneath, is in the quadrant layer?
Yeah.
Right.
So Kuadrant would be responsible for translating its
Yes.
language
To implementation, basically.
to implementation specific language that is
Yes.
limitador, authoring,
Right.
blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And then again, if you are like where I'm a polyglot, I speak Authorino, I can go talk to Authorino directly. And maybe you'll learn Authorino language because you have to, because you need to do this fancy stuff that wasn't quote unquote designed to be supported at the quadrant layer.
I think there are multiple features of the product that are quite obvious that they deserve that kind of abstraction right at the upper level, such as the ones that you mentioned. But because we are imperfect, and mostly because things change, right? I think it's to some level it's inevitable that sometimes we will leak by details from the underlying components at the upper level, because we can only think on that as something that belongs to this particular component today, right? Say any feature that only exists in limitador, for example, that nobody can possibly imagine that transposed to any other component. But I don't know, maybe in 2 years from now, we happen to see a use case for that also to be implemented in Authorino, and it's just like that, it becomes something that we should have an abstraction for at the layer of quadrant, right? Instead of two fields, one to configure in limitador, another one to configure in Authorino, right? But I think that happens, and as long as we try to, and maybe that's what you're doing here, right? Is you're provoking us to try to think that in advance and making sure that the mistakes we can avoid now, we try to do that, right? But
well, this two
some
things
ways to happen.
that I'm proposing. Yes. So what you described as a problem, yes, always like perfect. Sadly enough, not happening. And as long as I'm on this team, there'll be mistakes. Sorry, guys. That being said, what I'm concretely proposing here is not that, though. Meaning that whatever makes it to the quadrant layer gets expressed at the quadrant level. If there is this one thing that in some cases you need to tweak inside limitador, you go to the limitador CR. If that needs to be bubbled up again, like let's use restartability as an example, right? Let's say it only has semantic for limitador. Well, you don't have a limitador indentation inside your YAML thing, like a limitador map entry or whatever, to say limitador restartable. No, you have I don't know, HA enabled true, and then possibly it means nothing for Authorino, but for limitador, it means now that it needs to survive. It needs to be restartable. Maybe it even means that there needs to be another, making shit up here on the language, right? So, but you get the idea. So that's the difference, right? Everything gets expressed at the quadrant or policy layer, right? That's another one because we have that one, right? I want this policy to be restartable. I just made that up now, but maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe it does. But I can go for the distributed case, right? I want this policy to apply in cluster A and C, to be shared with cluster A and C, right? And yeah, and again, right? So you have those layer, and then again, it's the intent that you express at that layer, and then the house we keep it underneath, not hidden away. They can go through them if they need to, and they can then also express things in incompatible ways, which would then mean that we need to be very good at status reporting, saying, "Hey, you wanted this thing." This thing to be restartable, but you have explicitly configured your limited door with restartability off because you said limited door explicitly needs to be in memory only, right? So you go, well, sorry, can't do that. So you talk to whomever configured that. If it's you, then talk to yourself. Change that to one of the possible values that would let me enforce this policy as you want it to be. I just made things up again here, right? Don't focus on the actual.
Or just go ahead and shoot. I personally not sure how I feel about declaring the intent in one place and the how in another. If those two things need to be performed by the same actor, by the same user, right? If those two things need to be done by the same user, I would say they need to be done in the same place, not in two different places, right? Which is not the same of the cases where we, as in the quadrant operator, right, do the heavy work of translating from intent to the hows and the implementation, right? Those are two different things, right? Because you described a use case where something that exists only at the limited door level, for example, user would go to the limited door CI to configure, right? I think that sounds interesting as a concept, but I'm afraid that can be quite a dangerous road for us to take, because now we need to look downwards, to all the possible changes that happens in the underlying resources that otherwise we would just cascade down and say, this is the state of things. And we could decide, hey, if this is meant to be change it or touch it, it's in the upper level only. You know what I mean? So I think that's, and again, that connects back to the consistency thing, right? So if we want to apply that pattern, why not to go all the way and now users that modified something directly in the alt config, the quadrant operator should honor that regardless of what's in the alt policy. As a pattern, we can apply that to everything, right? So that's why I think it can be quite dangerous, quite hard, to maintain, to keep track of that. And therefore, the reason why I prefer the other approach, where the hierarchy is very well defined, right? If you want to break down with that hierarchy, there is no guarantee anymore, no support anymore. So in that sense, if you want to touch limited door, maybe you can touch a limited door, but then the quadrant operator can no longer be reconciling the things you do in limited door, and you're on your own, right?
Sure.
Things can break tomorrow.
That path we can go down as well, right? So I'm not saying it should be like a hard no, can't do this. If you know, you can tell it, or it's just, yeah, whatever happens, happens, right? You decided to go and tweak things. We're like, that's what I was saying, right? You talk limited door lingo because whatever. Well, there you go. Go do it. But now problem's on you, right? If that breaks stuff, like, don't come complaining.
Yeah, but how things could break then? Let's try to do that exercise. If the quadrant operator needs to honor the changes that the user performs directly in the limited CI, then we need to be aware of that, and that is the dangerous road that I was referring to.
No. Wait a sec. Wait. I need to understand that better. Why would the quadrant operator concern itself? It doesn't need to honor any changes in the limited door CR. I'm confused about what that means.
You're saying that a field, let's say, that allows you to configure something in the limited CI, if it only exists in the limited CI, then the quadrant operator should just ignore that. And whatever the user sets on that field, the quadrant operator will keep, rather than create a new version of the limited CI without that value. I guess that's what you're proposing.
More or less, yes.
Because a different case is when that field exists in both CIDs, right? So a
No,
user
that's not
could
what I'm
configure
arguing
that.
for. The former, like it only exists in limited or CR, but this is why I don't agree with you that in yours it knows about it, because if you type 42 in this field in Kuadrant and it happens to mean blue for limited or, it knows that, right? So maybe blue is the default value in case the field wasn't set. So that's what it'll use. And the supported values are yellow and red. And now if it's fucking another color, green, did I use green yet? Yeah, I did, right? Orange, then orange, it's going to tell you, well, then whatever, like it can be one of two things. I cannot do what you're asking me to do because I know this value that's there is not compatible. And you said it, so you're like, sorry. Or it can go, well, I don't know what's going to happen, right? Because you said this to orange. So, well, so be it.
Now you're bringing that decision, that complexity into the quadrant operator, right? The quadrant operator needs to work that out.
Yeah. He's the
do,
translating layer. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And you don't see any problem with that?
Well, I don't know what you call a problem. If you're asking, is it going to be easy to implement? The answer is no. But I'm like, what we're doing right now. Wait. What we're doing right now is we're table flipping. We expose all the fields up and we let the user deal with it. So you need to document it, as Byron proposed, which is obviously not wrong. But you know what? Code is just another way of documenting things, right? So if you can put it in English, hopefully you can put it in Go.
Wait, we're not table flipping. We're very on the contrary. I think we are we're being very, very cautious and conservative. So we say,
no.
Is that something that the user should be ready to touch? Then it's in the Kuadrant CR.
No, that's
Otherwise,
not the way. That's
it's
not
not.
the way. Sorry, that's not the way this works. The way this works is, so let me use distributed, like global rate limiting, right? So we implement something because that is the easiest way to implement it, okay? And I insist on every single word I'm choosing right now. And that's history. That's just what happened, right? So if people don't agree with that, then rewrite history. So we do it in a certain way. We go, all right, cache Redis. That's the way to do it. So the way you do it is that we need those fields exposed, right? Well, it turns out over time, some of them didn't make sense. So we get rid of them. So now all of that needs to be exposed to all the levels. And now if you want to do global rate limiting, you need to go inside the limited door section of your Kuadrant CR, configure that thing as Redis cached with those values. Well, we clean many of them up, but there is still some that remain relevant to your use case. You need to know about that stuff. And now that's part of your API, and that's how you do global rate limiting, right? So if that's what you call being intentful about what we decide to expose to the user, then we just don't agree on the terms. I don't think that's being intentful. That's happening by accident, right? Now, if you want to support, instead, you could look at it the other way around and said, what I wanted as a user is for all the rate limit policies that look alike across all my clusters, I want to make sure that those are shared. That's the intent that I described. What I just described before was the how. We decided to achieve this system. Now those two things are coupled. And I'm asking for decoupling those things. I think the latter is more intentful than the former. And maybe we're not agreeing on that definition of things.
I don't think we're saying different things here. And now I think we're even risking looping and going in a loop here in the conversation. But that's precisely the difference that I try, to make the point here between leaking the abstraction versus coupling, right? So I think now you describe the problem of the coupling that came along when we decide to expose.
Yep.
Exposing was not the problem, or leaking was not the problem. But because we didn't thought that through enough to think that we could have abstracted better instead of just making that, hey, this is the Redis configuration, right? So the problem, we create some coupling. So the problem was decoupling, was not
Yeah.
exposing. The process, in my opinion, is correct. We should continue to say, we need to expose something for the user to configure this feature that allows persistency of the counter somewhere.
Can we use
Right?
observability in this case then? Right? We need a
Yes.
collector address. All right.
Right, that's even a better example, because we
Mhm.
assume that all the components will probably be sending the traces for the same collector, for example. Right? So why would we create 3 different fields, one for limited door, another one for author, another one for the WASM plugin, and so on, right?
Mhm.
Instead, we want to create just one, the quadrant level, right, that
Mhm.
abstracts, and we use that when we configure the other ones, right? When we configure the
Mhm.
subcomponents. A good example of creating the abstraction, exposing the field without creating the coupling,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I think so. I think that's desirable, right?
Right.
But that's
Yes.
what I'm arguing for.
No, but you mixed up something else here, which is, what if the same field exists in the limited OCR and the user goes there and changes in the limited OCR?
Well, it will need to exist.
That's
right?
that's a different conversation.
No,
in my
no,
opinion.
it
That's not the same
has.
thing.
No, no, I'm not saying it's the same thing. It has to exist. It will exist, right? There is no way the only way that Quadrant can talk to limited door is through the limited door CR. We agree, right?
Right.
So if you need to send a piece of information to limited door from Quadrant, you need to modify the limited door CR. So your
Correct.
collector address will exist inside the limited door CR as a configuration bit.
And you're saying that if it exists in limited door, because it has to exist, the user should be allowed to change the limited OCR as well.
That
Now we have 2 sources of truth.
no,
And the
no, we
quadrant
only
operator
ever
needs to
have
decide
one.
which one.
No,
Genre.
I don't agree with that. But I think we always only have a single source of truth for the given things. It's how you start looking at them. So I could say that in the case of the collector address, the default that I want my components to use when I enable tracing at quadrant layer is this thing. If now for a reason XYZ, I decide that all my limited door things need to go elsewhere, I think that one's a little fucked up, by the way. So this is why I use the level stuff. I think that's a better example. I want my tracing to be level XYZ for quadrant as a default. Now shit hits the fan. It's limited door related, right? Don't forget that people pay for those services, right? So instead of bumping the level up for all of their shit, they can go to the individual component and raise it. So in this case, they say they override the value that was set as a default for the entirety of the thing. So I still argue that I would want to have the default, say, tracing level be configured at the quadrant layer for all of quadrant, but I don't think it's wise to prohibit somebody to know better for a subcomponent, and they should be able to do that.
Can we walk through another example now?
Yeah.
So you're saying that in the observability one, the tracing endpoint, for example, the endpoint of the collector, the thing we put in the quadrant CR works as a default. The thing that occasionally users will set at the level of the subcomponent overrides that default, right? Let's pick another example here. The alt policy again in the alt config. The alt config has a field called hosts, right? Do you think that the host field of the alt config should override the host that we pick from the network resources because the alt policy does not have a host field?
No, and I think you should be able to reflect that reality. So I'm going to pick on observability again, right? So let's say there is an on-off switch. I'm not saying it's a good API, but think about that, right? And you're like, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up observability on at the quadrant layer, right? And then somebody goes and disables it at the limited door layer. I think that should be reflected, like as a conflicting thing. Which one wins? Because I think that's where you want to get at when I said the overrides. Yes. I think overrides works for deployment stuff, right? I think and this is why it's interesting in the case of limited door because they're one and the same in the end, right? a bit of a really weird thing that we do, right? Limitador CR has all the limits reflected into it. Then the limitador operator resplits those things out, and it's like, oh, all the limits go inside the config map for limitador to reload, and all the deployment stuff is the deployment stuff.
Mhm.
So I think like what is conflicting, back to the example that I took, the supported colors or whatever, right? I think really depends on what, and this, I agree with you, right? It's a difficult nut to crack and something that we need to be very intentful. And I don't think that there is a single answer for all of the above, right? Because I think it becomes a very use case specific thing. So back to your question now. Honestly, I don't know. I need to think about this very specifically, whether it's host, whether it's other things, by the way, right? Because I think the problem is bigger. We could do the same, with rate limit. Though that one's interesting because it's hard to track the identity of what the limit is, right? So in case of conflicting things, what does it mean? Who wins and so forth? Like it's a little bit of the same as the policy conflicting, and then you need to sort of have a default. All right, that's the heuristic that we build into the system. So I don't know that there's one answer fits all, if that's what you look. Actually, no. I would say that I don't think it's the case. It could be so that in the end, for all of the use cases that we have, the answer is always the same. But I wouldn't say that because so far it was always the same, that it's going to remain that way, if that makes any sense. That overrides, for instance, lower level overrides higher levels. I don't know that.
I don't think that for deployment and for the policies, we have two different cases. I think it's the same, right? The only way I could see a different approach for the deployment is if our APIs looked very different compared to how they look today. And in that case, we did invert the relationship between the subcomponent CRs and the Kuadrant CR. So in a way that in a Kuadrant CR, you could possibly point to the component CRs that you are using in a kind of a compositional way. In that case, I could see an inverted hierarchy between the things, and you say, okay, so if you have this CR here for limitador, and in the Kuadrant CR you point to that CR, so I know from the Kuadrant level that is the configuration of limitador that you want. Otherwise, I would imagine that it's for the Kuadrant operator to own that configuration entirely.
Well, so that's a good point, and I like the way that you composable aspect that you just mentioned. I think there's a few things to consider, though. One, it's the, let's say, 1-to-1. I don't think that you necessarily implied that, but I just want to point it out. So maybe there is a world where you have multiple limitadors and i.e. multiple CRs and so forth. So that's one. Two, I think there is a time aspect that I don't think should be ignored. Meaning that I'm going to reuse the example that with the tracing, right? And I want you to change the trace level because it's a temporal thing, Oh, there is an issue. I'll trace. I'll hunt it down. And so I change my thing. I think the user experience would suck if you need to, like, all right, that's the one that got created by the Kuadrant operator implied. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy it, create my own, then have that one point to that for the time that I need. Do you get what I'm saying? I'm not saying that's what you implied either, right? But I think the temporal aspect, I think, is interesting, right? Oh, you know what? This default thing, I just need this for this time because I'm hunting a problem down, because I know this is weird and breaks this policy for a little bit, but I know what I'm doing, like with great power, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, the temporal thing I think shouldn't be underestimated, right? And that's, again, one that we have right now, because somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but if you change something inside the limitador CR, the Kuadrant operator is going to eventually trigger that all of this sort of flips back, right? That's probably not what somebody would want, I think. So, anyways,
I'm gonna-
again,
I'll wrap it up. We're out
yeah.
of time.
I don't know that we'll get considered, but I think it's at the very least something that deserves some thought
Right.
cycles and
Yeah, especially I think where it comes to just the quality of the API for the end user of the Kuadrant end user, which is not necessarily the same as the person who wants to go deep down and change.
yeah, I was about to say quality is subjective, right?
Sure.
But the surface layer is something that is not. So I'm arguing for a smaller surface area, for a smaller area of the API at the Quadrant layer to just, kind of expose parts of it. And then if you need all the power, well, you also take the responsibility and you learn the entire language, right? And then whatever this means. And will this mean incompatible deployment scenarios? Well, the answer is yes. How well we can deal with that? Well, that actually is I think Guy raised an interesting point, Maybe we want that thing where really it's all power to you, right? Maybe we give you a status that says unknown because we have no idea. It's really not, we don't know what this means. And we're like, hopefully it means something to you. And if it means something to you, then awesome. But also maybe we're like, well, okay, we don't know, but hopefully things work out well. And then indeed, right, says policy accepted, but maybe it's a lie because what you did underneath is you decided, let's say rate limit, there is a allow all traffic flag at the limited order layer that just goes, yeah, whatever, everything goes through.
Can we translate this into into something actionable? Like, for example, you're making a proposal, or should we take this up from the bottom up? Like, just take one example.
Yeah, one
feature
example then. That's what I said. What I'll be working on for the distributed rate limiting.
Right.
The
Okay.
RFC is I wanted to leverage some of that in
Because
there.
ultimately, one of the important things you're saying, I think, is basically we should not just blindly copy everything upward. We should think about what we expose, and that I think everybody agrees on.
Yeah, I certainly don't expect that to be a contentious point. The thing is, yeah.
But
yeah.
we have not been doing that necessarily. So, okay.
No, I know. I have to blame me. Like
I blame you for
examples that I gave, like when I was mad at the Redis cache. That's me. So it's all my fault.
That's a wrap.
Leave it at that.
See you next week, everybody. Thank you.